trying to get ourselves and our minds ready for that. We started out with some ideas about loving God. The first commandment. The second commandment was loving others, trying to focus on that. And then last few weeks have been talking a lot about missions and going out and discipling. And today we sort of have the opposite going on. We're going to talk about Peter, and it's the exact opposite of evangelism. When someone asks Peter about Jesus, Peter replies, I don't know what you're talking about. And they ask him again, he said, well, I don't know that guy. And then they ask him again, no, I really don't know him. And Peter in his life, I think he had 3 weaknesses that led to that decision that night. And I want to talk about that today and how we can avoid those things and how we can do a better job when people ask us about Jesus of actually presenting Jesus to them. So I think the first thing that got in Peter's way that night was pride. And that pride, he says in Matthew 26:35, even if I have to die with you, even if I have to die with Christ, I will not deny you. Has anyone had pride before? It's going to be a very quiet day, isn't it? It was already quiet in Sunday school, and our Sunday school class is never quiet. Well, how about we look at some pictures then? That's pride right there. Few people get that. Pride, Peter had a lot of pride in groups. When he was with the disciples, he had pride. He said to Jesus, I will not deny you. Even if all these other people leave, I won't deny you. And the Last Supper, Jesus washed the disciples' feet, and what did Peter say? Not me. Because he had pride. And pride leads to some trouble, if you didn't already know that. And we'll see what kind of trouble that can get you in. Pride goeth before the fall, right? And after the fall, what happens? Regret and injury. But pride, I think, turns a cat into a lion and an eagle into a canary. Think about that for a second. If you have pride, you think of yourself as more than you ought, and you think of what's in front of you as less than what you should have. Anybody watched some basketball lately? Did anybody think that they had too much pride in their team yet? We've had all kinds of interesting games so far. And that's what happens when you have pride. You underestimate your opponent, and it leads to regret. And that's what happened to Peter. So let's look at what Peter had to deal with that day. And really, that's not exactly what Peter had to deal with, but that's how I kind of imagined this scene. When these people come after Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, they come after him with clubs and swords and things like that. And I imagined Braveheart or The Patriot or whatever movie that was. And Braveheart? Okay. I get them confused. Anybody else get them confused? Anybody else not know what I'm talking about? But that's how I kind of imagined it. But then here's what it really looked like. You've got a Roman soldier with a spear, knives, things like that. And Peter had his little dagger. And when we read the scripture, it says sword. But when you research that word, it's not really the sword that we think of. I think of a William Wallace kind of sword where you kind of have to slide to actually use it. It was more like a dagger. It's bigger than a pocket knife, but you probably got steak knives about that size. And Peter's going up against these people who came with clubs and swords. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it says a great multitude. John clarifies it for us by saying it was a Roman cohort, the commander, and the officers of the Jews. How many people do you think that was that showed up in the garden to arrest Jesus? In your mind, when you think of that story, how many do you think? You got to shout it out. Just shout some numbers out there. 50, 100. I always imagined it as a small group, and then I started to think about it. And I thought back to watching NCIS on TV and cops. And when they go to arrest somebody, well, they're going to arrest one guy who's got 11 guys around him. I figured they'll send at least 22 policemen, right? Try to get some kind of an advantage there. I think 50 or 100, it was a whole bunch of people. And so what does Peter do? Well, let's see, what does Peter do? No, he doesn't run. Okay, so what did he actually do? He just chops off a guy's ear. And I thought about that for a minute. And that's one of the other stories that some people can actually read the screen, so this is funny. But that's one of the stories that we think less about than what really happened. When I imagine that story up until this week, I imagine Peter walking up to someone, chops off the ear, Jesus picks it up, puts it back on, no big deal. But you've got 11 people here. Who knows how many swords and knives are involved? And you've got 22 at least, maybe 50, 100 people with clubs and knives. When Peter comes out there with a knife and cuts off one guy's ear, what's the next thing that happens? Everyone behind him gets mad. And at that very moment, we could have seen the end of Christianity because of Peter's pride. They could have instantly killed all the apostles. But they didn't. I don't know what calmed them down. I don't know what happened. I think part of it had to do with Jesus picking up the ear and putting it back on. But can you imagine if pride ended the church right there? Newspapers in Jerusalem say, man of peace arrested, dozens killed, hundreds of casualties, whatever. That's what pride can do. Second problem that Peter had was laziness. And laziness is not just being tired, right? There's a difference. Matthew 26:41 says, what? Could you not watch with me 1 hour? 1 hour. That's all Jesus asked for. He's in the garden asking them to pray. And the thing about Jesus is he gives second chances, right? He asks them all to pray, and what happens? Fall asleep. He wakes them up, asks them to pray again. What happens? Fall asleep. And he asks them again, and they fall asleep again. Before that first time that Jesus asked them to pray, Jesus asked them to pray another time. At the Mount of Transfiguration, he asks them to pray, and they all fall asleep. This is not the first, second, and third chance. It was the second, third, and fourth. But laziness, like I said, is not just being too tired. It's not doing what needs to be done. When you have a job to do, not doing that is lazy. So I will show another picture and see if that... It reminds me of stories that happened to me. And what it says is, I forgot to buy more snacks, a little plastic bag with a note inside. I forgot to buy more snacks. I hope my love is enough fuel to get you through the day. XO, comma, mom. Have you ever done that? I never got a note when my mom forgot my lunch. We ate hamburgers at my grandparents' house every Saturday. And one day my grandma made me a nice hamburger. Lettuce, tomato, onion, a couple slices of onions if you know me. Pickles, more onions. Mustard and ketchup. And I bit into it and there was no hamburger. And one day I went to school and I would take those big thermos bottles and you heat up the hot water in it and then you put in the soup or whatever, it stays hot all day. I opened it up and poured it out in my bowl and it's hot water that I went to school with. So I know about this. I know about this picture. I know what's going on. But just like this young child probably missed out on a sandwich or some snacks, the disciples missed out on a lot when they were sleeping. And we had two pictures for that. The Transfiguration, they missed a lot that day. Transfiguration is one of the few stories that's in all four Gospels. When Jesus starts to pray and all of a sudden he's changed. His face is changed and a bunch of other stuff happens. But in the story today, when Jesus went to pray, his face was changed, and they missed it. How was Jesus' face changed? Do you remember? He prayed so hard and so deeply that it says that drops of blood came down like sweat. And he prayed for the disciples. And he prayed for himself, and he prayed for us. And the disciples missed it. They didn't miss all of it, because you remember, they can still tell us the story that Jesus asked them to pray, and they fell asleep. And he woke them up. So he knows that, or they know that he was praying, but they missed out on most of it. A lot of us miss out on a lot of good things if we're lazy. If we've got too much going on and feel like if we don't give ourselves the energy to do what we need to do. And it's strange. It's hard for me to preach this part of the sermon because I sat through a sermon one time about not being lazy. And it was hard for me because I'm kind of a lazy person. But what was hard about it is I felt like, what's the point? That's not what a sermon should be about. But then I come to realize that all the disciples missed out on when they were lazy. And it was convicting to me this week because I realized, I started thinking about all the things I've missed out on. And I think that was one of Peter's problems this week. Peter had a busy week. Starts with Palm Sunday, the parade. You've got the dinner party at the Pharisees' house. You've got clearing out the temple. A bunch of stuff that's going on. And Peter misses out on one of the most important parts. And we'll go ahead and go to the next one and see what that is. Okay. Third problem that Peter had, I think, was cowardice. How can I say Peter was a coward when he went off, chopped some guy's ear off? I thought about that for a while. Peter had a lot of pride when he was in a group. But when he was by himself, I think he was a coward. What kind of words described where Peter was in the scripture that we read? It's kind of thinking back. He was, and I may be mixing in the other Gospels, but he was by the fire. He was on the outside. He was at the doorway. He was away from the action. But Peter followed him at a distance to the high priest's courtyard. Peter wasn't right there with Jesus. And because he wasn't right there, a lot of trouble happens. Let's see the first thing, which I thought was kind of funny. We think of cowards, that's who you think about, a cowardly lion. But because Peter was a coward, he denied Jesus 3 times. Because he was a coward, that's what happened. I thought you were going to do the next picture. Because he was a coward, that's what Peter denied Jesus 3 times. Unfortunately, it wasn't a basketball game. And I think it's a pretty funny picture, especially this time of year. But Peter denied Jesus in one of the most important times in the life of Jesus. The time when he needed people the most. The time that was most dangerous for him. Peter denies him. And I guess one good thing about it is the other disciples deserted him. But Peter was at least close enough to deny him. Maybe we can say that's a positive. I don't really know. But Peter denied him 3 times. Let's pull those up there for a second. First time, the servant girl says, "You were with Jesus of Galilee." And Peter says, "I don't know what you're talking about." Not a clue. And then he kind of runs away to a different spot. She follows him and says, "This fellow was also with Jesus of Nazareth." And he says, "I don't know the man." I think I put the swearing in the wrong spot. But the third time, surely you are also one of them, for your speech betrays you." In the NIV, I think it says your accent gives you away. And I think Kayla was reading the New King James, but you probably noticed her accent. You can tell she ain't from around here. Probably tell that about me too, but it was pretty obvious that he was with Jesus because of his accent. Surely you were one of them, for your speech betrays you. So what does Peter say? I'm glad nobody wants to say what Peter said. He says some bad words there. And then he says, I don't know the man. He calls down oaths and curses upon himself. Some commentaries say he actually cursed Jesus. That was how low he had gotten that night in this weakness. And that can happen to us. But the good thing about that is we can recover. So let's look at some advice. Peter was there. He knows all about this stuff. And he says about pride, God resists the proud but gives grace to the humble. 1 Peter 5:5. Peter knew about pride. He knew the dangers of it. And so he can actually talk to us about humility. It's hard to take advice from someone who hasn't been there. Has anyone here ever taught kids before they were a parent? See some nodding. Did you ever try to give parents advice about how to raise their kids? Bad idea. But when somebody's been there, they can give you advice. They can teach you. And because Peter was there, and he had the pride and he had the regret that comes from being proud, we can listen to him. We can learn from that. Peter also knew about laziness. 1 Peter 5:8-9 says, be sober, be vigilant, because your adversary, the devil, walks around like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. Peter fell asleep, but he tells us to stay awake. And the reason we need to stay awake is the devil's wandering around like a roaring lion, about to devour us. How many of you do they do that around here? Have a night at the zoo where you can sleep with the animals and stuff? Really? The zoo in I'm not going to repeat that for the CD. But the zoo in Knoxville, Tennessee actually does that. They have kind of an enclosure where the kids can sleep on one of the inside areas where you can kind of look at the animals while you're sleeping. They're usually sleeping too. But can you imagine being in an area with a lion and trying to sleep? He wants us to stay awake spiritually because we've got spiritual enemies that are seeking us like a roaring lion. Peter, I also think, was a coward that night. He might not have been a coward his whole life, but I think at that moment he was. He says, yet if anyone suffers as a Christian, let him not be ashamed. I think he was ashamed of Jesus at that moment. He was ashamed that he knew him. He was ashamed that he set down his nets and followed Jesus. Remember what happens after Jesus is crucified, before he meets up with Peter later. Maybe that's too vague of a question, but eventually Jesus runs into Peter, and Peter and the guys are out fishing again. He kind of gave it up. I knew the battery was running low. The singers ought to get paid overtime for this week. It's all well and good to talk about how Peter's been there, but how did he get there? How did he move past this? Have you ever gotten a point in your life where you had these struggles and you couldn't get past it? Peter gets past it because I think one moment sitting there with Jesus. And Jesus and Peter were sitting there at the beach, and we'll get a little picture of it. Probably not what it actually looked like, but Jesus takes Peter aside, and they kind of walk away. And Jesus starts to talk to Peter. A lot of you know this story. You also know why it's significant. When we read the scripture, it says 3 times, Peter, do you love me? And that's strange. Why do you ask him 3 times? And the reason is, they're different words for love back then. They're all translated love today, but they had different words for whether you loved a Big Mac or if you loved your wife. We don't. So it's kind of unfortunate, isn't it? They had 4 words for love. Agape, that's kind of the deepest love. That's kind of the love that God has for us. Phileo, like Philadelphia, it's brotherly love. It's the kind of love that friends have. Storge is the family love. And eros, well, probably should skip that one, right? Yeah, a few people get that. Okay. First time Jesus says to Peter, do you love me more than these? It's a big statement. What was Jesus pointing at when he said, do you love me more than these? He pointing at the boats and the nets and the fish that Peter had run back to? I think so. Do you love me more than all this? And Peter says, yeah, I love you. But he said the word for friendship. So I say, have up there, you know that I'm your friend. Kind of strange way to respond, but Jesus asked him again, do you love me? Jesus isn't going to ask so much as to say, do you love me more than all this, but do you love me at all? Yes. You know that I'm your friend. Okay. Jesus tries a 3rd time. Am I your friend? Do you have the phileo kind of love, the brotherly love that friends share with me? Yes. You know that I'm your friend. And it puzzled me. Why did Jesus do that? He asked him if you love me more than these. That's a big commitment. But he kind of settled for, am I your friend? That's not very good negotiating, is it? When you watch Storage Wars, that's not the kind of stuff they do. Or Antique Archaeology, what's that show? But that's not what they do. They talk it up. They start from a starting point and get bigger. But that's not the way Jesus does. Jesus doesn't expect us to be perfect right at the beginning. He'll meet us at our level. He's going to say, hey, am I your friend? Simple question. And that's kind of what we have at this time in service. We have the invitation. And Jesus says, am I your friend? He doesn't expect us to be perfect. He doesn't expect a huge commitment right then. Just be simple. Quick question. Am I your friend? And that's what brought Peter back. So I'll ask you all to go ahead and stand as Steve comes up to offer the invitation. Not asking for big things. Just simply, if you don't have a relationship with Jesus,